Thank you for tuning in to the Political Soup, where you hear editorial about the issues of the day and political philosophy. Your hosts are Nick Alex, our progressive, Dana and Pugh, our conservative, Paul Laws, our classical liberal, and here is our moderator and your host, John Toll.
Hello, I'm John Toll, and welcome back to the Political Soup podcast. Tonight we're going to be talking about the Electoral College and how it might affect the outcome of tomorrow's election. We have the usual guys with us, Dana, Nick, and Paul, and they're going to tell us a little bit about their opinions. The article that we're looking at is actually something put together by the Encyclopedia Britannica blog, and we'll have the link down below that you could check out. Either pause my face now and read it, or read it after the thing. So let me start by just giving a little intro to those who are not too terribly aware of the Electoral College. The general idea is that each state has a couple of Electoral College representatives, and they don't have to actually vote for the popular vote of that state. They can opt to vote otherwise, although usually that doesn't happen. The idea, I think, originally was that the Electoral College was to kind of help the people make their decision when they weren't informed. Back in the beginning of the United States, not a lot of people read, not a lot of people were well informed about politics. Not that we have a perfect record now, but there's a lot more information available to a lot more people a lot more easily. There is some debate on how viable the Electoral College is and how necessary it is for today's voters. So if you look at the article, it gives you a lot more information about what happened and what can happen if there's a split, the Electoral College votes slightly differently than the popular vote. It happened to Al Gore in 2000, and there's a chance of it happening again today between Barack Obama and Mitt Romney. So let me get some opinions on what you guys think, and I'm going to start with Nick on this one.
Thanks, John. I think it's interesting when we thought about having this topic. I thought for sure I was going to be let's just it served its purpose. It's an outdated institution. It's just plain undemocratic, and in a way it is. I mean clearly the argument I would have against the Electoral College, quite simply, is not all votes are valued the same. And that the votes of those states that happen to be swing states like Ohio this year, or Virginia, or Florida, quite clearly those votes count more than my vote sitting here in Illinois, given that I know we know how the state's going to go, and I guess the one positive is we don't get to see as many presidential commercials, campaign commercials right now. I couldn't imagine being in Ohio and just watching that in between every show. Certainly an article or an advertisement for DVRs. But the more I thought about it, and the more I started to look in the history of Electoral College, there were some uses to it, and certainly our founders felt that it was there to protect our government from over-factionalization, meaning certainly more than two parties kind of splitting power, and the fact that we have electoral votes and each state awards kind of like a winner-take-all, that really limits the influence of third parties and reduces the number of necessary factions in order to make a government run. You certainly don't have those benefits in European democracies, where you have to have governments that have to basically come to power agreements, and the Electoral College is part of the reason why we have that stability. So it's not as clear cut as I thought it would be.
Well, let me go back to your first point when you talked about how votes in some states can be worth more than in others. Can you explain that a little bit more?
Yeah, I think it just comes down to if you can have an election that quite clearly, like go back to 2000, we had a candidate that received more votes than the eventual winner of the election. So in order for that to happen, that must mean that that each vote isn't weighted exactly the same. So in the case of Al Gore and George Bush won the electoral vote despite having a half a million less votes tallied for him in the total electorate. So if in order for that to happen, for somebody to be the winner with less votes, that automatically has to mean mathematically that not all votes cast are exactly the same, and that's because us as an electorate, we don't actually vote for the president. We vote for the electors that elect the president.
Which is a strange concept. I think a lot of people that don't understand. And looking at that sort of skewed voting, can you explain too why the swing states like Ohio and now Florida are so important to the campaigns?
Me or these other guys?
Oh, you know what? I'm gonna throw this one at Paul, and then Paul, I'm gonna go back and get your opinion on this. But just if you could kind of hit me up on that last question, why is Ohio and Florida so important to the campaigns?
Well, they simply because they have enough electoral votes. I mean, Nick's right. The electoral votes are weighted towards states that have lesser population, and that's on purpose. If we did away with that, then if it was just a popular election, then the places that would win the elections would be the places in the country that have the most population. So instead of doing a bunch of ads in smaller areas and rural areas, they'd be doing a bunch of ads in Chicago, New York, LA, that sort of thing. But I mean, the big reason that they're so important is because of the fact that they have votes in them, and they generally are fairly undecided for whatever reason.
So the point is because Illinois tends to be, because of Chicago, heavily weighted towards Democratic future presidents, etc. It's usually
Candidates.
It's considered that our votes don't really matter a whole lot otherwise, especially if you're going to be voting against that, because we have a small number of electoral votes, and the state generally votes one way anyway. Whereas Ohio has a lot of people that it's more of a moderate state. People kind of decide on the fly who they want. I mean, and why is that true for Florida? I can see how that works for Ohio, but how about Florida? And then this is
yeah.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say, it's about certain demographics, right? That when you look at Ohio, it has 18 electoral votes. You look at Florida, it has 27 electoral votes. I mean, the Florida by itself is 10% of what you need to win the presidency. So they're important states from the fact that they have high vote loads. And then, but what makes Florida and Ohio different than Illinois or California or Texas, other kind of really electoral vote rich states are there's more of an independent streak to them, or the demographics of those states kind of play into it could swing either way. So Florida has a very high senior population. It also has a very high Cuban population. It has some urban centers, but it also has great pretty large suburbs too. So it's one of those states that it demographically just fits into the perfect kind of swing mentality, and that's why it's been a swing state for as long as I can remember.
Okay. You know what, Dana, I haven't given you a chance to chat yet. What are your thoughts on the entire Electoral College idea versus popular vote?
I am generally in favor of the Electoral College. I think that I tend to default to a position in support of the Constitution and the Founding Fathers, and I think they had generally a good reason to set up the Electoral College. I can get into that a bit, although I just wanted to respond to something that I think it's not exactly accurate to say that votes are wasted within non-swing states. Say within Illinois, for instance, the casting a vote for a Republican is a waste. The fact is we are voting for the state's electoral votes for the Electoral College. And as a Republican, I will vote and I will lose. but that's still a vote. It doesn't mean that it's wasted any more than voting for Al Gore in 2000 or voting for John Kerry in 2004 or John McCain in 2008 was a wasted vote. I mean, it was a vote, and it was a losing vote. And that's exactly what votes within the Electoral College system are.
Well, and this brings up a good point. I mean, maybe waste is not the right term, but
No, it's
here's
not.
an example. Here's
And
an
I
example.
said it.
I backed
Well,
you
you're
up.
not the only one, though.
Right.
You're not the only one.
It's
Yeah.
commonly said. But here's an example. Chicago, or Illinois in general, is a good example of why popular vote might be advantageous to people who are, for instance, Republicans in a state that normally votes Democratic. If you get out from underneath the Electoral College, in this example, your vote counts exactly equal to what every single other person in the country is, no matter where they live. And that might change things, and I don't know the answer to whether that's good or bad. And honestly, I've been of a mind to wonder about the Electoral College myself, but I don't know enough about it. And frankly, I'm learning right now as we talk about a lot more than I knew before. Now, Paul, what's your opinion on it? You've given me a little bit more background. You've answered some questions, but what's your opinion on whether the Electoral College is a good or bad thing?
Well, generally speaking, I think it's a reasonable compromise. I would much rather have the states choosing on a more active basis, but I think it's a reasonable compromise. I mean, as long as we're under the system we're under, I think that the Electoral College is good.
Okay, now what do you mean by states being more active in choosing? What do you mean?
I'm essentially talking about the way that it was prior to our current Constitution. Under the Articles of Confederation, it was a little bit more. Our states took an active role in a little bit more active role in choosing their leadership. Essentially, we sent a Continental Congress. The Continental Congress elected one person to be president. That's essentially what I'm talking about.
Okay. And you said it's a compromise, so what's the other side of that coin?
Complete democracy, which we're
Meaning-
not.
Okay, complete democracy meaning popular vote.
Yeah.
Right.
Well, I mean, I would think you mean that, direct election of. Yeah, I mean, we're a republic. We're clearly not a complete democracy, but.
Right.
Yeah, I think part of the issue is, here's the thing I have a problem with. Clearly, and I'm not trying to pick on Dana here, but it's just because the founders thought of something and it was in the Constitution doesn't mean that we keep it. I mean, there are a couple prime examples. I mean, clearly we didn't used to elect our senators directly either. That was afforded to the state houses in the state governments for each of the states. So there wasn't a direct election of our U.S. senators. Until later on, well past the days of the founding fathers.
I oppose that too, by the way.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was a mistake.
At least you're consistent.
That was definitely a mistake.
Yeah.
So,
Change that.
again, the Electoral College is in some ways a relic of like the old fights of North and South, right? It's there. It was created for some altruistic purposes, like we talked about at the beginning about making sure that we don't have a factional government. But there was also, clearly a détente of sorts where you're talking about North versus South. That the Electoral College was there to help, preserve some balance of power because if it was a pure popular vote. The South would be overwhelmed by the population centers in the North, so the North would be selecting the president, basically every single time. So, I mean, that clearly was part of the original design. That coupled with the 3/5 compromise, which allowed the southern states to count, 3/5 of a slave as part of their population, even though those slaves didn't have a right to vote. I mean, those are clearly both relics of a power struggle that we still see today, to be frank. So So there are things.
Seriously, I don't think we count anybody as 3/5 of a person anymore, really.
No, but I'm saying North versus South clearly still is a power issue. But you're right. Yeah, I'm not saying that we count 3/5 of a person, nor do we deny people with a vote. But I'm just saying.
I understand that, but I just wanted to clarify because it sounded like you were saying that, and I knew you.
No, but we got rid of the 3/5 compromise. So it's not like we couldn't consider getting rid of the Electoral College. So, I mean, there are issues I have with it. I mean, clearly, but I mean, I also think there are other things that are probably more important to tackle. So,
yeah, I don't mean to imply that the founding fathers were Moses bringing down tablets written by God. Certainly, they're not infallible, and arguments could be made on any specific part of the Constitution that it should be reevaluated. It's just my default position is that it's worked pretty well so far, and so I have to assume that they knew what they were doing. That's not the end of my argument. That's more the beginning of my argument. Rather, it's the beginning of where I formulate an opinion, for the most part. Just that when we first started discussing this issue, when we first raised the idea of discussing this issue, I should say, before I even looked into the arguments, I was inclined to support the Electoral College, and the more I looked into it, I guess I've developed reasons now to back that up.
Okay, what are those reasons? I mean, if you wanted to get to the middle and the end of your argument, Danon, where would that be?
I've been afraid all week leading up to this podcast I'm not going to be able to do this justice. I've been reading into it, and I don't feel like I have a grasp on it to really argue my point. So I guess I'm kind of providing excuses for myself ahead of time here.
Well, go ahead and just throw a couple things out that are in your mind still, and you don't have to give me the full account. Just
well, I guess fundamentally, or the first point to make is that the founders weren't setting out to make a democracy, and that several of them had spoken out against democracy, against pure democracy. They wanted a representative republic, and it's not an accident that we got one. A couple of quotes. One's long, so I'll skip that. But it's from James Madison, and basically says the democracy's never ended well, if I can paraphrase it. Then Alexander Hamilton, in ancient democracies in which people themselves deliberated, they never possessed one feature of good government. Their very character was tyranny, and their figure was deformity. And John Adams spoke out against it as well. Basically said there was never a democracy yet that did not commit suicide. So this was a way of, in a way, I guess, avoiding some of the negative features of a pure democracy. I guess I've heard some people from the left refer to, like, the discussion of gay marriage comes to mind when I hear liberals, other left-wingers talk about the tyranny of the majority and the will of the minority, that to sort of argue against the idea of majority rules all the time, and that minorities need the rights to speak up and so forth. And it sounds like that's very much what the founders set out to ensure when they created the Electoral College, is that it wasn't a pure majority. So to go along with that, part of the argument I find appealing is that it prevents. This goes in line with Nick's comment on the North and the South. I think really any kind of demographics, any regional or racial or industrial demographics, that when a candidate campaigns for the president, he can't just focus on one demographic. So like in Nick's example, he can't just focus on the North. Or in more modern examples, he can't just focus on California or California and New York. You can't just focus on metropolitan areas. For example, a presidential candidate can't just go into, I'm drawing a blank, Texas, say, and talk about all the positives that he'll do for the oil industry, or Florida and talk about the orange industry, or any given thing that regionally would be appealing to that group of people, because I guess the very existence of the Electoral College requires a candidate to spread out more. That getting 100% of the votes in a single state with the Electoral College is no different than getting 50% of the votes. Whereas without the Electoral College, with a pure popular vote, getting all the votes of California or all the votes of Texas would really overrule a good chunk of the United States. Does that make sense?
Yeah, campaigns would change tremendously with no Electoral College.
Right, and there's some expectation that campaigns will shift to focus mainly on metropolitan areas, that members of smaller states, members of rural areas would be all but ignored. When you can go into a metropolitan area of 10 million people and generally appeal to that class of people and get 10 million votes, why waste your time going around to all kinds of rural areas to get 100,000 votes?
And make no mistake, eliminating the Electoral College would also be a huge blow for states' rights.
Yeah, and that's another reason why I was inclined to support it too. And I think that's something we've gotten so far away from the power of the state. I don't mean to sound like a Confederate here. Certainly, we live in the federal government, but but we've gotten so far away from the power of the states in terms of autonomous states, each enacting their own separate laws, their own ways of doing things. Everybody looks to the federal government now to solve state problems or local problems and whatnot. That some of the meaning of the Electoral College, some of the significance of the Electoral College, I think it has gotten lost with that. And part of the appeal of the Electoral College for me is to get back to that issue of states, of people, I guess, sort of seeing themselves as a member of a state first in terms of certain issues. Again, I don't want to sound like a Confederate. Certainly, we're all Americans first before, an Illinoisan or whatnot. But I guess there are certain issues that I am in favor of returning power to the states and shifting some of the tax burden to the states, shifting some of the oversight back to the states, and keep them local, and we can affect more power at the state level and at the local level. And I think the Electoral College goes hand in hand with that.
Okay, and you know what, Paul, go ahead and sort of give us an idea, and Dana just did a very good job of it, but I want to hear from you what you think states' rights reduction would be with the loss of the Electoral College.
Well, losing the Electoral College, I mean, essentially, the states are allowed to elect their own electors, and generally they do that through general election. And the general election typically will show the way that those particular electors will vote, but of course it doesn't have to. They can vote in other ways, which is of course by design. But it's all wrapped around states. It's all wrapped around the states having the ability to control that idea, having the ability to say, okay, these electors are our electors, and and in addition to that, states can also distribute electors in any way that they want to. I mean, if they want to say, okay, half the election went to this party, so we're going to give half the electors to this side and half to the other side, they could do that. Or 3/4 and a fourth. They can choose the way that they separate them. So I mean, it really does come down to state control over who is elected for federal leadership.
Okay, and what would you have to say to the argument that, and this is a question that any of you can answer really, talking about the value or the weight of a vote. One of the arguments for removing it is that really, if you live in a metropolitan area, your vote is less important than somebody who lives in a less populated area. That's not exactly true, but in general, that's the idea. I mean,
it is exactly true. It's definitely worth less. Like if you live in California, your vote is definitely worth less than if you live in, say, Indiana. But I mean, it's the nature of the beast. It's just how it goes. I mean,
Is it, you mean because of the 2-vote margin there that they give?
Right. Well, I mean, the point is that if you live in a state that's highly populated, your vote counts for less, and there's some that would argue that that's not exactly fair.
based on
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt Paul. I just want to make sure that I understand the question in terms of that electoral votes are determined by the number of House of Representatives, a number of representatives plus the number of senators, which for every state is 2. So the minimum that any state plus the District of Columbia.
Plus 3 for District of Columbia.
Right. And the District of Columbia has the same number as the least populous state. And so the least populous state has 3, 1 representative, 2 senators. I want to say maybe 7 other states share that. But that gives it statistically a wider margin, I guess, than a large state. Like the 2 senators sort of give it a disproportionate weight compared to the 2 senators given to California.
Right, and that's one of the...
Is that the basis of your question, or
well,
did I misunderstand?
That's a good point, though. The idea between that, what you get for the House of Representatives versus what you get as a bunch of senators, is the senators are set up 2 per state no matter what. So it's kind of equal footing. If you're in a state, you get 2, doesn't matter what your population is. Whereas House of Representatives sort of more fairly represents more populated areas because they get more House of Representatives for their state representatives. Mm-hmm. So that part of the argument with the Electoral College, you don't exactly have that. Or am I missing a point that you do? I mean, is there a way to... I guess what I'm asking is there sort of an in-between solution that would involve the Electoral College that took into account population while still making up for a situation with a state that has a very low population?
There's an easy way. Well, I wouldn't say it's easy, but there is a definite way. I mean, going back to what Paul was saying earlier about states' rights, and to me, I get what he's saying, but to me, it's probably the least convincing argument for keeping the Electoral College. The reality of the situation is that we have 48 states that elect a winner-take-all. So based on the popular vote in that state, you get winner-take-all electors for that state.
Not always. You don't have to.
40. Well, I'm just saying right now, 48 out of 50 states award their electors that way. Most people don't understand that they're actually voting for an elector, because when they see the ballot, they see the candidate for president's name and vice president's name there as their choice, and that's who they think they're casting their vote for. So 2 states, what they do is they award it by congressional district. And then whoever wins the total state popular vote will get the 2 kind of senatorial electoral votes thrown their way. So if we had all 50 states, for example, award their electors based on vote totals in each congressional district, and then the winner take all for those extra 2, you would see a much different campaign and a much more balanced way of going about vote totals. I mean, vote totals then are really kind of being awarded by congressional district. Be an incredibly complicated campaign, though. You're starting to really think about how do you target certain congressional districts, and where's your best chance for getting that kind of district. It also means that every 10 years with redistricting, that the strategy has to change, and the fact that we can gerrymander state boundary lines brings a little bit of uncertainty into the way a vote like that could work. So I mean, there are some definite ways to try to even out the vote totals, but that solution also is fraught with other issues, I guess is where I'm going with that.
Yeah, it reminds me of another point, is that under the Electoral College, fraud is generally isolated to one state or a small handful of states. And let's say the Democrats control California, and might be easier for Democrats to, I'm just picking Democrats because
that's okay.
Republicans in Texas, that it might be easier for them to exercise fraud in the elections in the state of Texas. Republicans would be, but there's no reason to because it's already going to go to the Republicans.
Right.
In a popular vote, then we have fraud. Basically, we have the rewards for fraud across all 50 states, across every district. Further, if there is a close election, then we open up pretty much every district, every state, every polling location to recounts. To the election could change on any given polling location or any given district. It'd be a big nationwide issue there as compared to, say, in 2000 when it was pretty much focused on 2 districts in Florida.
That's a good point. Now, one of the things in the article also mentions that 9 states have passed the National Popular Vote Plan, which means essentially that whatever the national popular vote is, whoever's winning, they require that their electoral votes go to that candidate. So I don't know if that's a better way of doing it or not.
An unconstitutional way of doing it.
Well, that's a good.
Is
good
it
point.
states' rights if you allow the
It isn't unconstitutional, but it is wrong. I mean, it's not what the
it's circumventing the Constitution.
Yeah.
Oh, sure.
It is circumventing
it's circumventing the intent of the Constitution, right? Which is that
I guess I'd have to go back and read the letter of the Constitution, but sure.
It's most certainly circumventing the idea of states' rights. And by the way, that is a very powerful idea. I understand, Nick, that you're not nearly as excited about states' rights as I am, or probably Danon as well. But I mean, you're a central planner. You like the idea of everything being centralized in D.C., but that's just not typically too efficient in my mind.
I was just making a mention that I felt that it was the least convincing argument against for keeping the Electoral College.
Well, it's the most convincing in my mind.
I say that not because I don't believe in states' rights. I think just the reality of the situation is most people in their states don't understand the intent of the Electoral College, nor do they understand that the electors that they're voting for are chosen by the parties that that are controlling that.
Why wouldn't they understand?
I'm just saying most people don't.
But that's part of the problem. I mean, why wouldn't they understand? If most people don't understand, then perhaps we're not educating people properly.
Oh yeah.
Perhaps we need.
That's what we're doing here today, Paul.
And that's true, because honestly, you guys are educating me. Because frankly, until this year, I didn't know that we were voting for an electoral representative. I had no idea. An elector. Thank you. So.
Okay, you have a very good point, Nick. But I guess I'm just simply trying to make a little jab at socialized education.
No problem.
All right, Danon, you look like you had one more comment on that. I just think you were saving it up.
I guess just to add to what we've been saying in terms of the state rights is that a lot of the way that our federal government was set up is that it sort of comes from the states. That at least it seems to me that the founders had intended that our eyes be kind of trained on our state governments, and from the state governments or from our legislatures, then comes the federal government. That the federal government is representative of the states, not necessarily representative of the people, if that makes sense. Because if you look at the way you mentioned, the way the senators were initially elected, they were chosen by the state legislatures, which means that we would have to pay a lot more attention to who we're electing to our state legislatures, because then they would send their representatives to Congress in the federal government. But even looking at the House and the Senate, the way that they were constructed, that the House is proportionate to population of each state, whereas the Senate is proportionate to each state, as 2 per state. And that it seems like so much of what the founders have done, the Electoral College included, was based around maintaining autonomous states, all within a federal government, but finding a way to have people represented, the people represented generally proportional to population, but also to have the states represented and not to have the small states crushed by the higher states. Say not to have the majority crush the minority in that sense. And to sort of weight the smaller states a little bit more compared to the larger states.
I think it kind of goes to the ideas that the founding fathers had about kind of tempering the union.
Yeah.
Makes sense. All right. Well, guys, we've hit a little past the half-hour mark, so I'm going to close this up. And you know what, Nick, I'm going to give you one last chance to do any final closing thoughts on this, and I'm going to hit the other two here in a second.
Yeah, I guess the thing I would say is, for those of you that are worried about the Electoral College or don't quite understand it, there are. My concerns will always be based on the fact that I think we should empower the people's voice, and I think you do that by direct election of our officials, and that's the issue that I have truly with it, and why I would lean towards saying that the Electoral College is certainly an outdated institution. However, I always like to make sure that when we do things, we are aware of what might be an unintended consequence. And clearly, I think quite a few people out there thinks it's such an easy thing that if we can have a candidate with less votes win the election, that's a problem. Trust me when I say the law of unintended consequences. You can have things that are a lot worse than that, and the complexity and the drastic changes that you have to campaigns in the future. It might not be something that is ultimately good for the union, and I think it's important to understand both sides of the issue. This is not a cut and dry issue. It's not simple to say keep it or leave it. So that's what I would tell people to think about, and go vote.
All right, good points. All right, Paul, final thoughts?
Well, actually, I guess my biggest thought is, I like the Electoral College. Yeah, I don't really know what to say beyond that. But let me take a little bit of time to say, don't go vote unless you're educated. If you've done the first two things, if you have educated yourself on Western philosophy, and if you've educated yourself on the ideas, and you understand what you're voting for, then please, by all means, go vote, and go vote in droves.
All right, thanks, Paul. And Nick, we'll save that argument again for another episode. We'll get back to that, I promise. All right, finally, Danon. Last but not least.
I'm much clearer now, by the way.
Yes, your resolution's improved. You are.
Oh,
yeah.
good. Oh, good. My connection is improved.
High res.
In all my glory.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. I guess if I had to put it into concluding thoughts, it's just that the idea of switching to a popular vote sounds good on the surface, but that obviously the signers of the Constitution had a reason for making the Electoral College, and worked pretty well for the last couple of 100 years, and that there must be a reason for it. There were still a couple of arguments that I didn't get into, which was my own fault. Like I said, I'm not an expert. As much as I tried to look into this, I just can't articulate all the arguments. But they are out there, and so I know that generally a majority of Americans favor eliminating the Electoral College, but I think that's just because it's an argument that sounds good on the surface. But anybody who holds that position, I would encourage to look into it in a little more depth.
All right, thanks, Dana, and that's a very good point, actually, from all the participants. Thank you, and yeah, really go out there and do your own research and see what you think, because it's a lot more complicated than you might think on the surface. And I'm I'm a guilty party. I would say earlier this year, maybe not even a month ago, I would have been in the camp that said, dump the Electoral College, what's the point? But as hopefully you've learned in this episode, it has a point, quite a few of them. So once again, thanks guys for your time, and we're signing off this episode of the Political Soup Podcast. We'll catch you later. Have a good one.